Today, we're digging into one of the absolute biggest challenges in tech, and maybe for humanity itself. How in the world do you teach a machine to be moral? And look, this isn't sci-fi anymore. This is a very real, very urgent problem that engineers and philosophers are trying to crack right now. All right, so let's just dive right in. When we're talking about AI ethics, we're talking about huge, real-world problems. First up, you've got the black box issue. Sometimes even the people who built the AI literally don't know why it made a specific decision. And that leads directly to the responsibility gap. I mean, if a self-driving car crashes, who's to blame? The owner? The programmer? The company? Then you have the bias problem. An AI trained on our data, well, it picks up our biases too, often the worst ones. And finally, the value problem. Whose morality are we even programming into this thing? The coder in California? The user in Japan? A government? And that right there is the multi-trillion-dollar question. To get around these massive risks, the real goal isn't just to build an AI that can follow orders really well. The goal is to build an AI that can make its own ethical choices when the path isn't clear. So this is where we get to the idea of what experts are calling artificial moral agents, or AMAs. You can think of it like this. They're trying to design an ethical operating system, a kind of conscience that can guide an AI's behavior in all the messy, complicated situations the real world is going to throw at it.
Now, this is a really, really important distinction to make. The goal here isn't to create an AI that feels guilt or has a genuine conscience. No, the goal is actually way more practical than that. It's about designing a machine that simply acts in a way that all of us would look at and say, okay, yeah, that was a moral choice. The entire focus is on behavior, not what's going on inside the box.
But here is the first massive roadblock. I mean, think about it. If you ask 10 people to define what the right thing to do is in a really tough spot, you're probably going to get 10 different answers. We humans have been arguing about this stuff for thousands of years. So if we can't even agree, which moral code do you pick to program into a machine? Well, two big philosophical ideas have kind of risen to the top as the main candidates. On one side, you've got utilitarianism. You can think of this as a moral calculator. It just crunches the numbers to find the action that leads to the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Seems like a perfect fit for a computer, right? Just do the math. But on the other side, you have deontology. This is more like a universal rule book. It says, nope, some actions are just fundamentally right or wrong, and I don't care what the consequences are. And this also plays to a machine's strengths, following a set of rules perfectly every single time. And while that moral calculator idea sounds really intuitive, the thinking we're exploring today actually argues that deontology, this system based on rules and duties, might have some serious advantages when it comes to building a moral AI. You see, with deontology, the outcome isn't the most important part. It's the action itself. The only thing that matters is, did it follow the rule? So let's take a simple rule like do not lie. A utilitarian AI might decide to lie if it calculates that the lie will produce a better overall result. But a deontological AI, it wouldn't lie, period. Because lying itself is forbidden by the rules no matter what. And this is the core engine behind deontology, straight from the philosopher Immanuel Kant. It's called the categorical imperative. It's basically a stress test for any rule you might want to follow. Before you do something, you have to ask yourself, could I honestly wish that the rule I'm about to use becomes a universal law that every single person follows all the time, no exceptions? If the answer is no, then the action is off the table. And what's really fascinating is that you can actually turn that dense philosophy into a surprisingly clean three-step algorithm. So look, here's how it would work. First, the AI comes up with a plan, a maxim, like, I will break this promise in order to achieve my goal. Step 2, it runs that universalization test. What would happen if everyone broke their promises whenever it was convenient? Well, trust would disappear. The whole concept of a promise would become meaningless. So finally, step 3, it classifies the action. Breaking a promise fails the test, so it's forbidden. But this is no silver bullet, not even close. Trying to translate these abstract ideas into solid code is incredibly tricky. For instance, how does an AI know the difference between something that's just okay to do versus something it has a moral duty to do? Or what about rules that are way too specific? A maxim like, I will harm Bob, can't really be universalized, but the system still has to know that it's wrong. The logic here gets crazy complex really, really fast. Which, of course, brings us to the next gigantic challenge. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, we managed to build this thing. We code the rules, we iron out the bugs. How do we actually test it? How can we be sure that its behavior is truly moral out there in the wild? So, how would you test these new moral agents? Well, experts have proposed a really clever twist on one of the most famous tests in the history of computer science. Okay, so first, a quick refresher. The original Turing test was basically an imitation game. It was designed to see if a machine could fool a human judge into thinking it was human just based on a text conversation. It was all about imitating human thought and intelligence.
And this table just lays out the shift perfectly. The classic test was all about intelligence. The question was, can it think like a human? But the moral Turing test switches the focus entirely to behavior. The question becomes, can it act like a moral human? So you're not judging conversations anymore, you're judging descriptions of actions in tough situations.
So here's how it would actually go down. A human judge gets a moral dilemma, and then they're shown two different responses, two proposed actions. One comes from a real person, the other comes from the AI. The judge's entire job is to try and tell which one is the machine. And if they can't do it with any real accuracy, if they're just guessing, the AI passes. And the core assumption here is purely about what's on the outside. It doesn't matter what the AI is feeling or thinking. As the quote says, if we look at its actions and can't tell them apart from a moral human's actions, then for all practical purposes, it has the ability to be moral. It passes the test. But this immediately brings up a huge, thorny question. One the source material really digs into. Let's be honest, we humans, we're flawed. We don't always make the most moral choices. So, if the goal is just to be indistinguishable from us, is that really setting the bar high enough? And that leads us perfectly into our final section. Because even if we succeed, even if we build and test these artificial moral agents, their very existence could create a whole new set of deep, complicated ethical problems for us to deal with. Just think about these for a second. If we start outsourcing our tough ethical calls to machines, do our own moral muscles start to fade away? And if we create agents that we actually consider to be moral, do we suddenly have a duty not to harm them or turn them off? The very idea of morality, something that has been exclusively human, could change forever. And there's always the terrifying risk that an AI gives a perfectly logical moral reason for its action, but the action itself is still profoundly wrong in a way we never saw come. This gets at something called the paradox of automation. You've probably felt this yourself. You use GPS so much that you kind of forget how to navigate your own city. With AMAs, the skill we risk losing is our own moral sense. By handing off responsibility, we might become less skilled at weighing complex issues and less sensitive to the very things that make us moral beings to begin with. And this leaves us with one last, truly mind-bending thought to chew on. We're trying to build machines that can follow the moral rules that we give them, but our own moral code isn't set in stone. It changes and evolves over time. So the ultimate question is, could an AI, with all its processing power and logical consistency, ever identify a better moral rule, a new principle that we humans just never thought of? Could the student, one day, become the teacher?